Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to talk about the national debt. I'm really just going to talk about what is it, should you be concerned, what it's made of, and just everything about it, because I think it's something that everyone has heard of, but a lot of people don't really fully understand it. So first off, what is the national debt? And that is essentially what it sounds like. It's the debt the country has accumulated throughout the years. And the country has really kind of had debt for a large portion of it. However, the amount we have now is essentially the most we've ever had when compared to the country's GDP, or gross domestic product, which is essentially how much money the country makes throughout the year. And if you look at this chart, you can see in the 1940s, right after World War II, the country had a debt to GDP of 96%. So this means that the country had slightly more GDP than it did debt. And then over the next 40 years, it consistently went down. And you can kind of see on this chart, it looks a bit more clear, is that the national debt stayed the same, however the GDP went up. So it stayed at about $2 to $3 trillion. However, the GDP went up, so the percentage went all the way down to about 30%. And then in the 80s, it shot way up, and I know a lot of people really like Reagan for a lot of things, defeating the USSR and so on. However, he did cause the national debt to go way up because he got into office in 1981, and essentially over the next 8 years when he was the president, it went from 32% to 51%. Or if you look at the actual total debt, which has been inflation adjusted in this chart, he about doubled it. And the reason why this happened was because he cut taxes and increased spending. So, as you could probably guess, the government brings in less money, they spend more, the debt just goes up, because how else are you going to pay for it? And then in between 1980 and about 1995, the debt really shot up, and then it went down a bit under Clinton and then it went down a bit under Clinton, and then it shot back up in 2001, and it has not stopped shooting up since then, really. So now you know the debt has really shot up since the 80s. And the next really big thing you need to understand about the national debt is what a federal deficit is. So a deficit means that the government is spending more than it is taking in. And you've probably heard on the news that Biden has like a record-breaking decrease on the deficit. And while this is true, and you can see this on this chart, because 2022's deficit will be about 1.4 trillion. However, in 2021 is $2.77 trillion. However, this is not as great as it sounds. In 2020 and in 2021, it was about $3 trillion of a deficit in each year. And this is, it's terrible. And this is because of COVID. So essentially the government said, hey, the economy is doing terrible right now. How should we fix it? And what they did was they gave out lots of money to either people through all like the checks you could just get from the government during some of those times, like the $1,200 or whatever. And also a bigger thing that some people don't know about is the large amount of money that they gave to businesses. Whether it was the PPP loans they gave out to small businesses, which were essentially loans that they would give out, and then they just cancel it if you don't fire anybody, so it's just giving money straight out, or the large amounts of money we gave to various other businesses, essentially to prop up the economy. And it did work for a while. The economy stayed really strong in 2020 and 2021. However, as you can tell in this year, kind of fell apart because inflation went up, largely due to all this money being put into the market. So, back to the point, while the big decrease in the deficit is good news for Biden, it could have been worse, it could have stayed the same or even gone higher. It is good news that it went down. However, if you look at it when compared to other years, he really just kind of returned it back to normal. And if you'd like a more in-depth look at the deficit, here it is. So essentially, in 2022, the federal government spent $6.2 trillion, and it brought in about $5 trillion of revenue, which leaves like $1.4 trillion of a deficit. So this is just kind of a easy look at it for this year. So since the debt has been increasing by so much, so often, and has just not gone down, it has risen to $31 trillion. And if you would like a quick kind of live update, there's this cool website called usdebtclock.org, and it shows you everything down to the second from the US national debt and really anything about it that you could want to see. And one kind of shocking thing it brings up is that the debt per citizen is $93,000. So that means each citizen, if we wanted to pay off the debt today, each citizen, including babies, would have to pay $93,000. However, a better look at it is debt per taxpayer. And that is, for each taxpayer, we owe about $250,000. So that's just kind of crazy. And if you look at our kind of taxes, our revenue per citizen, so how much taxes the government collects per citizen, is only about $15,000 per year. So we owe $32 trillion. Who do we owe it to? So I know this is a really common question because a lot of people know we have a lot of debt, but we don't know who we owe it to. And a large portion is to ourselves. So as you can see here, it's about $12.2 trillion is to ourselves. So in case you weren't aware, the Fed and other forms of government can buy bonds in the government, so it's kind of complicated, but essentially the government owes it to itself in some way, but it still has to pay interest on it, and it still has to pay it out. So even though we do owe it to ourselves, we still have to pay it eventually. Then the second highest is probably something that everyone would thought would be first, and that is other countries or foreign. So the country that owns the most of our debt is Japan with about $1.2 trillion, then is China with about $1 trillion, and then England with about 2/3 of $1 trillion, and then a bunch of other countries have a few $100 billion of our debt. However, when you're talking a debt of $32 trillion, then a few $100 billion is not that much. And then the next highest debt holder we have is mutual funds, which is mutual funds buy the bonds just kind of as a really safe investment, because even though the US owes so much money, it is still seen as a super safe investment because they always make their payments. And then there's various other things that I'm not going to get into that owe small portions of the US debt. So now we know we have all this debt, we kind of understand it. What is the real problem with owing this much debt, or is it a problem at all? And to me personally, the biggest problem is the ever-increasing interest that we will have to pay each year. So as of this year in 2022, the United States debt will have to pay $48 billion just to maintain the debt. So this essentially means we just pay mainly the interest on the debt, and this makes up 12% of our annual tax revenue. So that means every time you give the government $1, they're spending 12 cents just on interest for their loans. And as I'm sure you can figure out, this will just steadily increase over time. I mean, before you know it, we'll probably have 20% of our tax revenue just go to interest, and we need to fix this in somehow. This is the biggest problem with the national debt, in my opinion, is that if we're just wasting money like this, I mean, it's just as easy as it sounds like. It's just wasting money. So we need to maybe not even decrease the national debt, but how about we just stop increasing it? If we stop increasing it as the GDP grows, then it will be less of a big deal. If the United States was making $60 trillion a year in GDP, then the $30 trillion of national debt wouldn't be seen as a big deal. However, since we only make about $24 trillion, a $32 trillion national debt is a big deal. And honestly, that's the biggest concern of the national debt, is the rising interest costs. However, a secondary one is that as the debt grows higher, we may have to pay out higher interest rates for new bonds because it could be a riskier investment. As it is right now, we only have to pay about 2% interest on all of the US debt bonds because it's such a safe investment. It's seen as one of the safest investments out there, is buying a US federal government bond. However, if we owe twice as much money as we bring in, then it may be riskier and we may have to pay, a 3% interest rate, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 50% higher. So that's kind of the secondary risk. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to cover was, what are other countries like? So I know the United States has a ton of debt compared to our GDP, but what about everyone else? Because, we're in the US, or at least I'm in the US, and all I really think about is the US. However, what's everyone else doing? And if you look at this chart around the world you'll see the US is not the worst. And a quick note is that this was made at the beginning of the year. However, our debt to GDP ratio has gotten worse throughout the year. So while it says our debt to GDP ratio is 107%, it's actually higher than that. However, this is actually going on with most of the other countries on it too. So I think that reality lines up pretty accurately with this chart. So the first thing you'll notice is Japan. Japan is at 237%. And this is largely due to the fact that they had a banking crisis, the government bailed them out, and they've really just kind of been going into the spiral, and it has impacted them pretty negatively. However, that would be a whole nother video. And then next is Greece, who is 175%, and Greece almost went bankrupt. So neither of those I'd really like to compare us to. But what you will see is that the US is slightly above most of the countries I would personally like to compare us with, such as Germany or Canada or even the United Kingdom or something, or China, our biggest rival. So you'll see the US is a lot above those. However, you can also see the US is not unheard of. It's not like we have 100% debt to GDP ratio and everyone else of our people that we compare ourselves to are at like 20%. It's essentially all the governments across the world are in debt right now. So everybody is paying interest, and it's just a global problem at this point. And the way to fix it is really simple. It's not complicated at all. Anybody can figure it out. Just have governments stop spending more money than they make. If a government only brings in $1 trillion in taxes, then they should only spend $1 trillion like throughout the year. That's simple. They don't have to borrow money, just spend what they have and deal with it. And I know the citizens might get upset for a few years. However, I think people would also be upset if they knew 12% of their taxes was just going to interest payments. So, anyways, I thought this would be kind of helpful just to explain the whole state and explain everything about the national debt. So now it's time for your favorite part of the video, the joke of the day. Joke of the day, joke of the day, boop, boop, joke of the day. There was a race to find out who's faster, Congress passing a bill or a snail traveling 10 meters. The snail won by 2 weeks. So thanks for watching my video. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment about the video or about ideas for future videos. Thanks.